the Mind and Matter podcast. I'm your host, Nick Jikomes, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Aaron Gruber. Before that, just a few housekeeping items. One, we are back this week after a couple weeks off. There will be new episodes as usual every Friday moving forward. I have a pretty good group of guests booked or in the process of being booked for the next month or two. It includes people you've probably never heard of before because they have little to no social media presence, as well as people that have a very large social media presence and podcasts of their own. So I'm pretty excited about that. We also have t-shirts that are available on Etsy. There are a few different designs that you'll see. So if you've seen some of these that I've worn on the YouTube version of the podcast, you may recognize them, but look for the link in the episode description if you want to check those out. Also, I am starting this week a weekly newsletter, and I haven't sent it out yet, but I'll put a link in the episode description that will allow you to subscribe to that. I'm imagining that what I'll use this for is to give people weekly updates on the podcast in terms of what happened that week or the past week, as well as who some upcoming guests are. I will also provide a snapshot of some of the scientific research, at least that I've read in the previous week or two. So I'll just provide some bullet points and links to interesting studies that have come out related to topics that are relevant to the podcast. And I'll share things like quotes and tidbits from various books and other writings that I'm reading that I think are going to be interesting to people that like the podcast, as well as provide probably some short or even medium form writing of my own, just some of my general thoughts on either last week's episode or some of the new developments in the research world and things like that. So again, look for that in the episode description. So today I'm talking to Aaron Gruber, who's a neuroscientist. His lab studies how the brain learns from experience in order to make good future decisions. We discussed a variety of topics related to cognition and learning in the brain, including what we know about how the brain detects salience and assigns value, how it makes decisions about what to do, and how it constructs flexible models of the world that are sometimes called schemas. We also discussed how neuropsychiatric disorders, like depression, for example, can influence the brain's schemas, as well as how they are impacted by psychoactive drugs, ranging from stimulants to psychedelics. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. You can listen to the audio-only version on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, or any other podcast directory. You can also watch the video version on YouTube, which sometimes comes with visual components, movies or images that I'm looking at with the guest. And, please like us, give us a 5-star rating and all of that stuff. Comments are much appreciated. It helps give more visibility. And so if you do that, it really does help out. And also check out the episode description, both for the audio and the video version. I'm going to put useful links and things that you might find helpful down there. Today's show is brought to you in part by Dosist, an all-natural cannabis company specializing in dose-controlled cannabis products made with plant-based ingredients. To learn more about Dosist, their products, and where they are available, please visit their website through the link in the episode description. And with that, here's my conversation with Dr. Aaron Gruber. Professor Aaron Gruber, thank you for joining me.
Hi, nice to be here, Nick.
Can you start out by just telling everyone what you do and what you're interested in?
My background is maybe a little bit different. I started in an engineering discipline, went through sort of a computational route, and then ended up doing experimental work for the past 20 years or so. And so what I do is a lot of behavior, some pharmacology, so giving drugs. This is in rodents, and using technologies to record neurons as animals are doing things, and then using computational tools to try to understand how the brain is representing things and processing information.
I see. So you're kind of an engineer that became a neuroscientist.
Yeah.
That's pretty common, I think, given all of the engineering and the gadgets involved.
Yeah, it is now. Back in the 90s, it was a little more rare, but now, there's a lot of cross-fertilization between technology and biology. And it's really amazing how quickly things are going.
So a lot of what you study has to do with, some pretty big questions in neuroscience: behavior, decision making, cognition, learning, how all of these things interact in different ways. There's a lot of different directions we can go. One of the things I wanted to talk about first was dopamine. And the reason I wanted to start there was it's a neurotransmitter in the brain that many people have heard of. Probably most people who are listening have at least heard of it. And it's pretty well known, and there's sort of a cartoon version of dopamine that most people have in their mind, right? So the pop science characterization of dopamine is it's the pleasure molecule, quote unquote. Things that feel good cause dopamine release. This makes us want to do them again. Drugs of abuse, hijack the reward system by causing a lot of dopamine release, which is what can lead to addiction. And so can you just talk about what dopamine is and how accurate or complete is that sort of story we often hear about it?
Yeah, so you did a nice encapsulation, and I think it shows kind of the power of, I guess what we could call a meme, a conceptual meme. So the person that originally proposed dopamine as a pleasure mediator of pleasure walked that story back a few decades ago. But once the genie was out of the bottle, it's hard to revert that. So most people in the scientific context that study it, have long realized that dopamine itself is not pleasurable. And one of the reasons we know this is that one of the precursors for dopamine, called L-Dopa, is the first line treatment for Parkinson's disease, in which the dopamine neurons die off. And when you give someone L-Dopa, essentially that crosses the blood-brain barrier, that increases the amount of dopamine that the surviving dopamine cells release and kind of normalizes the motoric and other deficits. It's not pleasurable at all. And so physicians, neurologists have to titrate benefit with, how much will they actually tolerate, because it makes people irritable, makes them feel unwell. And so if dopamine really was the pleasure drug, then, you could go to the seedy part of town and, buy some L-Dopa or whatever, and it would make you feel good. And that doesn't happen. So it really seems that it's the opioid system is probably the best candidate for pleasure. But there's a lot of crossover. So, the fact of increasing dopamine can cause, downstream release of other things that do have these mood elevating properties. So that's, it's a sort of a testament to how networked things are and how much crosstalk there is. So that's the pleasure part. Now, there's an entire another story with dopamine that is fantastic and beautiful. It integrates biology and theory and computer science. And I guess, what I often tell my undergraduate students is that in a way it kind of broke my heart because it was so beautiful. And so the story is this, that the signaling of dopamine provides what's called a reward prediction error signal. And that means that things that are unexpectedly good increase dopamine. You get a little, like a 1 second, a little bit less than a 1 second kind of burst of dopamine. When things come just as you expected, it doesn't change. And when things are worse than expected, you get this dip. And so this is this linkage with dopamine as a learning signal. And so it turns out that if you have this kind of reward prediction error signal, you can learn some really amazing things. And so there's a company maybe you've heard of called DeepMind that was bought by Google for $500 million or something. And so this spawned this entire field of what's called deep reinforcement learning. So this idea of reinforcement learning is all predicated on this idea that if you have this reward prediction error signal, you can learn all kinds of stuff. And so this was actually shown in the early 90s from Andy Bartow, and who's retired, and Rich Sutton, who's at the University of Alberta. So if you do this, you can train a computer to play chess, to do robotics applications. Like it can do, a really a surprising and amazing array of things. Meaning you can solve algorithmically these hard problems just by providing this reward prediction error signal. Meaning that when it does what you want, you give it a virtual dopamine hit. And when it does what you didn't, then you kind of take that away, you pause it. And so just by giving that, you can learn lots of stuff. And so that came back to neuroscience. I mean, the original idea came out of neuroscience several decades ago, but then it was only sort of formalized starting sort of in the 90s. And then that kind of fed back from the computer science people back into neuroscience and said, well, hey, if algorithms can use this reward prediction error signal to solve all these problems, then maybe that's what dopamine is doing in the brain. That it's a way, it's a fundamental teaching signal in the brain to solve all kinds of problems.
I see. So computer scientists had figured out that if you had this kind of signal, it was very powerful. You could write computer code that was able to do impressive stuff using this kind of signal. And then in animals, neuroscientists discovered that actually there are dopamine neurons, it turned out, that instantiate this type of signal in the wetware of the brain.
Exactly. Yes. So Wolfram Schultz is credited. It's a neuroscientist working in Europe, was credited with doing recordings of dopamine neurons in a monkey. And a very simple experiment. You unexpectedly give them a raisin, and dopamine neurons would fire up. But if you played this game a few times, so if you approach them and you have the raisin in your hand and you open your hand, in the beginning they didn't expect it, and you would get the dopamine burst. But after a while, meaning 15, 20 times, the monkey would come to expect it. And now the dopamine neurons didn't fire anymore, even though he got the raisin. And then, scientists being what we are, we have to manipulate things. Now you come with your fist and no raisin in it. Monkey expects a raisin, you open it, it's not there. Now the dopamine neurons pause. So normally they're ticking along at about 1 time per second. And when they activate, they go up to they'll generate these bursts of 5 or 6 action potentials very quickly, and that causes the release of dopamine. And then the pause just means that you've got a second or so without that action potential in it. And so that was kind of the first, when people saw that, they said, oh, holy cow, that looks a lot like this reward prediction error signal.
And does that go just in the direction of positive valence? Do they do this in response to the presence or absence of rewards, or does it go in the opposite direction as well?
Yeah, fantastic question. So for quite a while, the emphasis was really on the positive part. But then what it turns out, so that's sort of the beauty of everything, right? That it's this relatively simple thing, this reward prediction error signal that can solve all kinds of hard problems without having to teach an animal or a computer like how to play backgammon or chess, just telling them you lost or you won right at the end of it, right? And the algorithm can kind of figure everything else out. But then, as you pointed out, then data that came in over time was inconsistent with that fundamental idea. And so one of those pieces of data are that some dopamine neurons, it turns out, respond to aversive things and to cues that precede aversive things. One thing I forgot to mention is that it's not only just the cue. So when the raisin comes out, but if you give it a tone or something ahead of time, so if you go, beep, and then 2 seconds later you present the raisin, what happens is that the dopamine neurons then they start to respond to the cues that precede it, and they'll actually propagate backwards in time. The reason that becomes important is for problems like addiction and overeating, and it ties into advertising. That the reason that brands become very it's thought the reason that brands become very potent is that if you've had a positive association. By having, the symbols and the logos and icons, right, they want to sort of drive that system. And, I would say a wider view of what dopamine and associated systems do is that they capture attention. And that what it looks like is that they're really there to detect what's called salience, which just is a term that means something is important behaviorally to you. So for an animal, that would be positive things like rewards, but also things that might precede a shock or a startling tone or whatever. But the idea is that if you're driving down the street, say you really love McDonald's, you're driving down the highway, even if you're not necessarily hungry, all of a sudden you see the Golden Arches sign, and that triggers like, oh, hey, should we get McDonald's? Right? That it seems to tap into that system, this sort of salient system of that information gets into your brain, and then you decide whether you're going to act on it or not.
I see. So is it fair to say that it's much better to think about dopamine as detecting salience and being involved with the motivation to act on what you're seeing?
Well, we think so. That's kind of my opinion. I mean, other people are much more still on the reward part. That's the beauty of science, is that different people can, be led by different hypotheses. And, we don't know. I mean, the truth is probably going to be somewhere in between. That, yes, it has something to do with value that we haven't talked about yet. But, this other data indicates that it's doing some other things too. So, one story that humans repeatedly discover about biology is that things get reused. And so in the beginning, it might very well have been only for value. But then, as time has come along, that same system now has been co-opted to do, other functions as well. Mm-hmm. And, we see that in lots of places.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you could unpack the idea from a neuroscience perspective of value a little bit more. Some of the things that come to mind for me are, when you think about these dopamine neurons and this reward prediction error signal, we know computationally this type of signal is very interesting. It can be used for learning. We know that some of these neurons are going to respond to good things or bad things, but also in some sense, the information of the goodness and badness was already there, right, in these neurons. Like if you're giving an animal a treat or you're giving it a shock, in some sense, it already knows that it's good or bad. So how does learning the goodness or badness of something tie to sort of instinctive or innately present notions of goodness or badness that are already there?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and maybe we can. I'd like to cycle back to that question in a little bit once we cover a little more territory. But let me unpack sort of the canonical reinforcement learning, which involves value, and then maybe later we can talk about some of these other things. So what you're saying is very important, that animals have to have these innate systems to feel pain, to feel pleasure. As I mentioned before, probably involves other things like opiates or opioid receptors and other things. So you have to have that. So it looks like dopamine really isn't involved in adjudicating, I really like that or I didn't. But we'll talk about value. So again, the canonical story is, imagine you have a choice between, two things, A and B, and you don't know anything about A or B, right? You're completely naive, and you go, and so they're food items. We'll just say it to make this easy. You go and you taste A. You had some expectation going into it, even though you hadn't tried it before. And this is something you actually need for reinforcement learning to work. You need a bit of optimism, because if you thought everything was terrible, you'd never try it in the first place. So you have to say, well, there's A, maybe they'll taste good, right? I'll try it. So you taste it, and there's some system that gives you some hedonic pleasure, right? It's sweet or fatty or whatever. And so you that somehow in the brain is translated, or I guess triggers a dopamine response. So if it was better than you were expecting, then you get this dopamine response. What happens then is that you presume that the sensory systems that were involved in seeing A, that somewhere in your brain, so you have the immediate sensory, visual, olfactory, whatever, but then you have these association cortices. And what they're there is they kind of assemble these sensory things into some internal representation of the thing. And then the thought is then the amount of dopamine that when dopamine gets released, that kind of stamps it with an amount of value, meaning that you have this pattern of activity that's representing the sensory elements, but that some of the neurons also that are involved in this pattern are going to signal the value of it. And so when dopamine increases, those neurons strengthen their synapses, and so they give an encoding of the value. Now, say you go to B, you taste B, and it's just sort of meh. Right? It's not great, not as great as A. So you have a different set of cells that were on for B. Say, it's kind of exactly what you expected, so the dopamine cells didn't turn on. Those value cells then don't increase their representation of value. Now when you have a choice, so you come back, so imagine, you taste A and B a few times. Each time you taste A, right, your assessment of value goes up. The value for B kind of stays where it was, right? Each time you taste A, you get a little dopamine that increases incrementally the valuation until it reaches some state where the taste and the hedonic pleasure you get from it matches your expectation. Then you don't get any dopamine change anymore. And so it stabilizes at this level. Okay. Now, when you have a choice later on, you're going to choose between A and B, right? You're at a party and they're out on the table. Say there's these Asian snacks that you've never seen before, and you go, like there's A. I got to decide between A and B. Well, what you can do is you can use the difference in valuation. And so if you learned that A had a higher value than B, then reinforcement learning, the choice element of it says that you should tend to pick the things that have higher value. And there's different ways you can do that. You could exclusively pick the thing that has the highest value, and that's called a greedy system, or you can kind of do it probabilistically, meaning that the bigger the difference, the more likely it is you're going to pick A over B. And so that's the reinforcement learning story. And you can do lots of amazing things with that. And the trick is just how do you convert, the hedonic thing to a dopamine, to a value? That's a very active sort of research question.
So how well would you say reinforcement learning captures what we actually observe in animals when you give them two choices?
Okay, so it's a beautiful theory, and it works really well in some contexts. So the one in the literature has the colloquial name of N-arm bandit, and so that's where you have multiple devices, and the one-arm bandit is a slang term for a slot machine. And so what that connotes is that you have these different choice options or different machines, and when you press the button, you have a certain probability of getting a payout. When you do this in humans and monkeys and even rodents, you get behavior out that's very consistent with reinforcement learning. So you get choices that kind of track the probability of getting paid out, or you can also do it with reward value. The problem comes in when you start to do different types of experimental designs, then it doesn't work as well. This is where I think the story, at least in my development of a scientist, I had to step back because from an engineering perspective, the reinforcement story is, right, it's beautiful, it's elegant, it makes predictions that you can test. But then, when you get into the actual biology of the brain, I think you really have to think more evolutionarily, and you have to think in terms of the environments that animals came from, and that the brain really evolved to solve those problems. And, historically, there weren't really N-arm bandits, there weren't, kind of these other things. And so, what we're kind of looking at in those kind of designs are maybe some of the outliers. Mm-hmm. So it's not, the term for that is ethological. So ethological would be the environment and conditions in which an animal species has been living for a long time. And so they've kind of adapted to these things.
I want to unpack for people a little bit more how you think about what a choice is at the level of the brain. So at a high level, it's intuitive, right? What a choice is. We all make choices all the time. If you see two items of food on the table, A and B, we know what a choice is. We sit there, we might contemplate it for a moment, and then we go, okay, A is better for some reason. I'm going to pick that one. Now, as a neuroscientist, how do you think about localizing where the choice is happening or what the mechanisms are? Like, for example, I can imagine that one way to think about it is, well, if I want to reach for A versus B, that requires two different motor programs to execute in the brain. And so maybe the choice is sort of whatever network or circuit is looking at both of those motor programs and then committing to one of them and or inhibiting the other one. How do you think about choice at that kind of mechanistic brain level and where you actually look for it happening in the brain?
So it's a fantastic question. It's a really deep question. I thought, going into all of this, when I was younger, I thought, well, obviously I know what a choice is. That's easy. There's a psychological phenomenon that's referred to as the Kruger-Dunning effect. I don't know if you're familiar with this. But what this is that if you ask people to rank their competence in something, and you actually plot it against how much experience they have in that domain, people with little experience tend to overestimate how much competence they have in that domain. But then as they gain more experience, they actually rank their competence lower. And then at some point, hopefully you have this inflection and, you become the master. And then, you can evaluate that you really do know what you're talking about and you really have the experience to talk about it. a good example for me is that mountain biking, which is something I've picked up in the past couple of years, right? I know how to ride a bike, and it's just riding a bike on a woods path, right? Well, no, there's a lot of skills that are different. And, it's not until you get out there that you realize, oh crap, I'm a newbie. And so anyway, going back to your, the question you're asking is very much an important one. And what I want to do is kind of go back a little bit. And for anybody who's interested in this, there's a really excellent book, and it's called The Evolution of Learning Memory Systems. And this is by Elizabeth Murray, Steve Wise, and Kim Graham. And so what they've done is that they asked this kind of question, this evolutionary and ethological question. And so they traced invertebrates back. And so the earliest vertebrate, meaning animals with a backbone, showed up about 500 million years ago. And so that's before flowering plants, that's before trees. The only things around are these kind of like ferny things, right? So it's a really long time ago. And so they asked the question, what do these animals have to do? And they were aquatic, so they're swimming around. And the idea is that, they have motor systems that they can swim around, they can catch whatever their prey was, right? So that when they detect the smaller things, they can eat it. When they see a shadowy thing, they run away from it. And so, you can think of those as responses in a general term, but, in a way, those are decisions, right? Do I keep swimming do I continue to try to harvest food, or do I run away from this thing because I see a shadow? And in very simple organisms, these things are all very kind of automated, right? The sort of prey drive and predator avoidance. As systems have evolved, really what's happened is that the same architecture has persisted, but it's become more elaborated. So even those very early organisms had homologs of even the medial prefrontal cortex. It had a simple visual cortex. It had, some subcortical stuff, the basal ganglia, and, these other, lots of these other sort of deep structures. And then what's happened over time is that those have really just sort of, elaborated. And in the extreme case of the great apes, right, we have this massive expansion of the neocortex. So the folded up kind of tissue that's out on the outside. And so in an ethological context, we really kind of have to think, or I think using that as a context to interpret behaviors and responses is quite important. Now, okay, that's a lot of pontificating on these things that might sound esoteric, but it still comes back into play. So in my mind, and I think there's pretty good evidence for this, you can have some choices are just mediated by your motor systems. So those are the circuits in your brain that control your limbs and other muscles. And so we have some good data for that, and we can talk about that some more if you want. There's other systems. So for instance, if you are having a conversation with someone and you're walking up to a vending machine to get a snack, and you just you sort of punch in a button or two to get your snack, right? That you might think of that as something that's more driven by your motor systems. And so maybe, most of the time you press B15, and that's, whatever snack that you're accustomed to having. And if you do that enough, that response is mediated by what's oftentimes referred to as the habit system. It's probably more appropriately called the sensory response system. But this is a system that involves, it doesn't really involve a lot of your neocortex, just the little strip of motor cortex. And it's largely mediated by the set of structures called the basal ganglia, which are evolutionarily, again, very, very old and very important for executing motor outputs. So that system is perfectly capable to generate a complicated output to get your snack. And what we find in the lab in animals and in humans is that you tend to rely on that more when other brain systems are preoccupied. So again, kind of looking at a higher level view, what I mean by that is that the brain has multiple systems that can guide your choice. So you can think of one as kind of a motor system, like I just described. You can think of one as more a cognitive system, where, you're debating over the calorie content of each snack and whether the chocolate was ethically sourced and, these more cognitive things. You have other systems that are more probably emotionally guided as well. And so you have these multiple systems that are interacting. And at any one time, one of them might have a larger influence on your choice than others, depending on many different factors. So, when you ask, what's a choice what a scientist would say is that it's some sort of response, which is vague, and it's intentionally vague because otherwise you have to make presumptions about what's doing what and what part of the brain is calling the shots. And that seems to depend on a lot of things.
I see. So the choice is related to the execution of a motor program and not the execution of potential alternative programs. But, what's happening just upstream of that
it can. Sorry, it can, but then, imagine another scenario that's largely cognitive. Mm-hmm. So imagine, choosing a car or vehicle, right? It's not something that really involves, it's much different than a vending machine problem. And so, it's unlikely that your motor systems are going to be largely the ones responsible for, generating the output in that case. So it's probably going to be a more, we like to think that it's going to be a more cognitive thing, because you're going to look at, gas mileage, or is it a hybrid, or, I have 5 people in my family, so I need something with a back seat. And, this gets more into the psychology literature, but what it ends up is that a lot of times people have already made an emotional choice about something, and then they just rationalize it. Mm-hmm. So, there's not really a utility argument to be made for, a red 2-seater Ferrari for $500,000, right? When a Honda will do the same thing. So, it's an important question. I think it's an active area of research, like how much of it is sort of emotionally driven versus sort of a cognitive system versus other types of systems that could generate a choice.
Mm-hmm. But it sounds like you would not say that there's one physical locus of decision making in the brain. Where quote unquote a decision is happening depends on the type of decision and all these other variables.
Yes.
So when we use terms like cognitive versus emotional versus motor, how, and this is going to be a somewhat vague question, we all have an intuition for what those mean. And in some sense, we're sort of imposing those things on the brain. How distinct are those concepts in terms of how cleanly they can be separated when we actually look inside the brain? Like there's circuits mediating emotional stuff versus cognitive stuff, and how much of it is just sort of linguistic convenience for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is, I'm using unabashed jargon. And it doesn't fly very well in a very strictly academic sense, but it's convenient to use that kind of jargon because it does convey kind of a lot of information, with very compact language. And again, your question is very excellent. And if I had to guess, if I had to place a bet, I would say that the motor systems are fairly separate from the other ones, but that sort of this idea of cognitive and emotion, I think, are very intertwined, and that there's not a clean separation. We know this, that there's a lot of good evidence for this. And so this is something, I'm quite interested in, and, it's something we can certainly talk about some more if you're interested in.
One of the things I wanted to ask you to help us think about is like the different types of ways that we humans learn compared to many other animals. So for example, we and our dogs can both learn from direct sensory feedback of positive and negative reinforcement signals, right? So if you think about training your dog, you give it a treat when it does something good, you positively reinforce what you want it to do, say in response to your command, and it sort of learns right there in the moment incrementally from getting that reward. We can do that type of learning as well. A lot of the learning that we've done throughout our lives is like that. But humans and certain other animals can learn and make decisions in other kinds of ways, it seems. We can actually generalize things that we've learned and make intelligent decisions in novel contexts that we've never actually been in before. So in some sense, we can know the right decision in a new context, even though we've never actually been in that context and gotten any kind of direct reinforcement before. So can you talk a little bit about sort of that difference between, say, the human and the dog and what might be going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's a great question. And I'll say right off the bat that I think animals' capacity to do what you just talked about is greatly underappreciated. So I think many kind of animals actually can do that. And I think even as back as the 1940s, so there was a very pioneering behavioral scientist, Edward, Tolman, sorry. So Tolman, he did these very clever experiments with animals, with rats, this is a good segue for this. So he would have, the simplest version of this would be that there would be a starting position, and then there would be a place with food. And what the animals learned just over a few trials is that there was one track that would go like this, kind of like a C shape. And so they would do that a couple times, and that's all they needed. And then what he did is he put them at the starting point, but now he had these dead ends that kind of pointed radially in all different directions. And so if the animals just learned, hey, to get my food, I needed to go directly west, right? And then go north and then east, right, to get my food. You might expect that to happen. And some animals did that. But the majority of the rats, what they did instead is that they went on the dead end that would have made a straight line for the food. And so Tolman was the originator of this idea of a cognitive map. And he meant this in kind of the spatial domain that, animals very quickly, and we now know that animals do this almost as soon as you bring them into a room, they develop a representation in their brain of locations in the space. And so the idea being is that, the rats, even though they learn that, they learn the food is over here only by their experience of running this way, they could use that and knowledge of the space to say, well, if I ran this way, this would be the fastest way to get there.
They could literally triangulate the shortest path.
I'm sorry?
They could literally triangulate the shortest path, even though they had never taken it before.
Exactly. Right. And so that's this idea of having knowledge and being able to act as if you had knowledge without actual prior experience of doing that. And so this is where I think the brain is, even the brains of many kinds of animals, still exceeds what we can do with artificial intelligence and machine learning. Even though artificial intelligence and machine learning, it's great at very specific tasks. It can now exceed, finding pictures of cats in large images and that kind of thing. But that technology is largely still beholden to the training set that you give it. Whereas the brain, what it seems to be really good at doing is acting in novel situations, which you mentioned before. And that's really important because the natural environments are tremendously complicated, right? So if you got into the woods, there's all these contours, there's leaves rustling, there's branches and tree trunks and scuttling critters, most of which is completely irrelevant to your behavioral well-being. And if you had to sit there and attend to all those things, you wouldn't be able to do the things you need to do. So, imagine you're foraging for mushrooms or, your grubs or, whatever it is. Most of the information that's coming in is irrelevant. And, the best estimates are that that's something like 10 to 20 gigabits per second. Like if you added all the sensory, the bandwidth of all the sensory information that's coming in. I mean, it's just tremendous. Mm-hmm. And it's so much that you can't attend to it all. And again, the problem that the brains have to solve is that only a few things in the environment are actually relevant to you or salient. And so this comes back to the dopamine system, that what might be happening is that's one way of, out of all this sea of noise that's happening or irrelevant information, when something important happens, right, you need to pay attention to it, whether it's good or bad, a predator or a food source. So that's that part of it. And now I can talk a little bit about this idea. So how do you act when you're in a novel situation? And again, just about every situation we're in is novel. So for instance, one of the just kind of humorous examples I give is that if I'm invited to go give a lecture at a new university, I wouldn't show up in my underwear drinking a beer, but sitting in my underwear having a beer is perfectly acceptable behavior in my house. So, but how do I know that, right? I never tried that. I never got the negative consequences with deans yelling at me and embarrassing videos on the internet and all the consequences that would happen. But I know, I'm pretty confident that that's what would happen. And so it's just, it's an example of that the brain embodies knowledge that it's gleaned through experience, but not necessarily direct experience, right? Because again, I've never done that. And that's, I surely know that's not a good thing to do. And I've not even seen other people do it, right? And so this knowledge, one term that people use to describe this is what's called a schema. And so your schema is how different things in the world relate to one another that you can use you can think of it like a simulation. So I can anticipate, hey, wouldn't it be funny if I did this thing? And I can think, well, if I did this thing, these people, well, they might be offended and that wouldn't be good, right? So you can actually think through to do those sorts of things and make those kinds of choices. And that's typically what's referred to as a model-based choice. So you've got a model of how things in the world relate to each other that you can use to estimate what's the outcome going to be. And that can be value, that could be negative consequences. Do you want me to pause, or do you want me to get back to why humans seem to be different?
No, let's keep going on this track.
Okay. So one thing, so you picked dogs, which maybe was an unfortunate animal to pick. Dogs are really interesting because they are, to my knowledge, they're the only animals other than great apes that can infer what humans are looking at by their eyes. So, if you spend a lot of time with your dog and you're looking at something, your dog will go and look at it. Try that with a cat or a bird or any other animal, just isn't going to care. That's not what they're about. And so, the reason why I think humans' capabilities and other great apes as well. I mean, we're not. We like to think we're a lot different than the great apes, but probably not as much as we think. To answer the question that you asked earlier, why do humans have this, seemingly very enhanced capability to generate these schemas or these mental models of the world, and the reasoning seems to be, and again, this is pretty speculative, but the reasoning goes something like this: that humans are very social. Well, that there's actually two explanations. One of which is that our ancestors spent a lot of time in the trees eating fruit, and that accounts for our very good spatial awareness and color vision, because fruits that are ripe typically change color. And so there's a utility in being able to tell which fruits are ripe based on color, because then you guide your foraging towards the riper fruits, which have more sugar, you get more calories, you have better fitness in your environment. So that is sort of the explanation for why humans' color and sort of spatial awareness is good, is that it's an artifact of tree dwelling and fruit eating. But these other sort of more cognitive things, the best explanation that I know of is that it comes from the fact that we're very social animals. And so being in a social group, it's quite important to be able to infer what's going to happen of your actions, because when you become dependent on a group, you really, it's not so much true in the modern day, but if you're, in a small clutch of animals, out in the jungle with lots of predators and, food scarcity comes around as the seasons change or whatever, you need to rely on the other members of your group. And so therefore I need to be very attuned. So if we're in the same group and I'm doing a certain thing and now I see you start to, grimace or whatever, I now have to infer like, well, what did I do or say that's like pissing you off? Because I don't want to do that. Because if I do that and, at a time when you have the food and I don't have the food, then you might not share with me. And so that's bad. And so that's sort of the argument where the ability of having sort of these very broad and rich mental models comes from, is that, that we have to do a lot of inference, particularly in the social domain. Mm-hmm. And that because that capability was very successful in the social domain, then it applies itself well to other things like mechanical things. And, we haven't been using tools that long, in the context of how long vertebrates have been on the earth, but we've been in social groups for a very, very long time, or, our ancestors have.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about something like a schema, some sort of model that the brain can construct, it's obviously a pretty complex phenomenon. It has to involve the direct sensory information, or at least some of it, coming into the nervous system right now in the moment. It has to involve probably integrating information from memory, these sort of different value systems and things. So it's a very, very complicated entity that we're trying to describe. How do you actually start to experimentally touch something like that and study it in the lab?
Yeah, so this is where technology is enabling. So, these ideas have been around for a while, but they've been largely theoretical, and very hard to test directly, because, the standard toolbox, prior to 20 years ago, maybe you could record 1 or 2 neurons at a time. You could do brain lesions. You can give pharmaceuticals. The difficulty with studying the brain in that way is that, if you damage a certain area and ask, well, does this part of the brain, is it involved in that kind of behavior or function? You take it out, maybe it was, but other regions can take over that functionality. And so it looks like there's actually very little deficit. So in the field, right, there's 2 questions. Is it necessary, and is it sufficient for a particular behavior? And it's actually quite rare in the neocortex to find things that are necessary and sufficient outside of the sensory area. So there are some, language specific centers that, if you take those out, then you can't understand speech or produce speech. There are some specialized things in humans like that, but in most other animals without language, that's not necessarily true. But that's not to say, like, if you have a stroke in a motor area, right, you can have motor, deficits and those sorts of things. Sorry, I got lost on the question.
Yeah. So what are some of the tools and approaches you actually use in the lab?
I'm sorry. Yeah. So the tools and approaches. Yeah. So there's a lot of redundancy in the brain, mm-hmm. and that, the upside is that makes you robust against damage. So if you do have a stroke, or you get hit in the head, or, something like that happens, you're not, other parts of the brain can take over that functionality, which, helps you to survive. It makes it hard to study it with the classic tools. But the new tools that people have developed now are sensors that can now record thousands of neurons at a time. Some of these are optical. And so we can now, I just use these tools. I didn't develop any of them. This takes teams of geneticists and engineers and, tremendous amounts of work. But, the tools have now trickled down to users like me, one of which are proteins that you can use a viral vector to express. This is similar technology to like the COVID vaccine. So if you get little plasmids of RNA and you get those into the cells, they'll express those proteins. And so you can do that. And some of the proteins, for instance, will fluoresce when they come in contact with calcium. When neurons activate, they typically let calcium come into the cell. And so what will happen is that the cell that's active will fluoresce when it's active, and then it'll stop fluorescing when it's not.
So you can actually use something like a virus or genetic engineering to breed animals that their neurons have proteins that literally light up so that you can see what they're doing when they're active.
Yes. And so doing that, you can record many thousands of neurons at the same time. Once you start doing that, now, once you have that information, now you can use machine learning and other computational tools to try to detect or piece together these more complicated things like these schemas. So things that are not, a direct consequence of you flash the light on and some of these neurons, turned on. That certainly happens. But what happens is you turn the light on, there's a few neurons that reliably turn on. There's other sets of neurons that sometimes they turn on, sometimes they don't. those same neurons, sometimes they turn on when a sound comes on or not. And so it's not completely obvious like what they care about. But, again, using some machine learning tools, we can now start to ask the question, well, what kinds of things do these cells care about? And it's usually combinations of other things. And so when we put those combinations together, now we say, here's a cell that, it cares about when this light has come on, but it's only after a reward. And so we can now infer that, these kinds of cells are encoding, some retrospective memory or something like that.
So there's some neurons in the brain, say in a patch of cortex that you're recording hundreds or thousands of neurons from. They might be relatively simple in that they have a very close correspondence to one particular thing in the environment. So if there's a light in one side of the environment, when the animal sees it, that neuron reliably fires. But there's other neurons that are somehow integrating all of these different channels of information. And so only when something happened in the past in a particular way and the animal sees something and it's moving in a particular direction or something, that neuron will be active.
Yes. So that's a really good explanation at the single cell level. And to find those cells, you have to sample, lots and lots of cells. So you need these, thousands. We're not quite up to hundreds of thousands, but technology is progressing rapidly. The optical is one technology. The other technology is essentially the same technology that's used to make microprocessors. And what you can do is you can make essentially a super thin shaft or several shafts that will have thousands and thousands of electrical recording sites on them. So in that case, you don't have to genetically engineer your animal at all. You just, you stick them in and now you get these electrical signals. And so, again, it's enabled by, technology in, engineering.
I see. So I guess the name of the game is that when you're studying something as complicated as the brain and how it makes decisions or something like this, the way that you approach it using a variety of different techniques, they could be optical, they could be electrophysiological, you're recording the activity of many, many neurons across a sizable chunk of the brain at the same time. You're actually able to do this in animals that are awake and doing stuff. And then you're essentially just using computational techniques and analytical techniques to try and literally decode what those neurons must be caring about.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the reasons it's challenging to understand the brain, one of the beauties of the brain is that it never looks the same twice. So even if you try to keep everything as identical as you can, successive times, it never looks identical. In the past, it was thought that was just noise. But I think the contemporary thinking is that that's really just a property of the system that is probably important. And I think, to add on a little bit, I think we can use, a good analogy is the weather. So if you imagine you want to predict the weather, say somewhere in the central United States, in the past, it would be like, we could have one temperature recording in Bismarck. So say you wanted to know the temperature in Cincinnati, Ohio, you can only sample one place in the United States, and you're trying to understand what's going to happen, somewhere else. Where the reality is that it depends on the pressure and, the air currents and all these things. And so what we're doing now, just like, weather prediction has gotten a lot better because now we can have lots of sensors all over the place, and we have better models of how the weather is changing over time, right? So it behaves as it's called a dynamical system. So anything with more than 3 parts tends to exhibit sort of these chaotic types of dynamics that become hard to forecast. So you can forecast fairly well in the near term, but the farther and farther out you go, the less and less likely you are able to forecast it. And that's because very, very tiny changes in the initial conditions change sort of the trajectory of the thing. And so the brain looks like that, right? So what we're doing now is it's like putting lots of temperature sensors all over, and now looking at how does instead of wind, now it's electrical activity. How does it propagate through? And so it's quite a different thing than like a computer or, a mechanistic kind of thing where thing A happens and, the cranks turn and you reliably get this other thing out. It's very much different. It follows these dynamical systems sort of properties. And so, going back with what we're talking about, the single neurons. So there's some neurons that reliably activate because of direct sensory input. That's kind of like the initial wind currents. Some of them are in North Dakota, some of them are in Florida. And by the time you get to the association cortices, right, they're having some effect. And it's not always the same, but what's interesting is that it tends to have the same effect, which enables sort of learning, associative learning, and these other things, as well as decisions.
So one thing I want to talk about is how things like certain neuropsychiatric disorders can impact cognition. And we've sort of built up this concept of a schema in our toolkit, which is just some sort of complex model that the brain constructs for a given situation. And it contains lots of different types of information, sensory information about value. It's connected to memory systems. Before we get there, is there anything else you want to cover that you think about cognition that would be important to convey before we talk about the impact of, say, depression or anxiety on these things?
No, I think it's a very good segue, actually.
So when we think about depression and anxiety, again, this is something where I think we all have an intuition for it. These are bad things. When someone is depressed, you don't feel good. You don't want to be depressed. And you also tend to look at the world in an overly negative way. I think everyone probably has a pretty good intuition for that. Can you start to talk about how something like depression or anxiety would impact some of these aspects of cognition that you've talked about, and what do we actually know there at the level of neurons?
Yeah, absolutely. What I want to preface this by is that what we call depression and anxiety is probably several different things, meaning that different things in the system can go wrong. And so, two different people, if they present with anxiety, it might be because of different reasons. For instance, there's one structure called the amygdala, which probably many people have heard about, that when it becomes hyperactive, it tends to produce anxious states. So things like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is strongly associated with hyperactivity in the amygdala. And so it's a system that it receives a lot of direct input. It receives output of the hippocampus, which is an essential memory system. And its job seems to be to form relatively simple associations, right? So, like in combat, if, you saw a certain type of, vehicle right before you hit a landmine or something, and then you're in a completely different context. You're in North America and you see that vehicle, right? You get this, stress response. And so we think that the amygdala does that kind of thing. And the reason you get the stress response is that there are, many small little nuclei that are in, around the brainstem, midbrain, that secrete certain neurotransmitters and hormones that trigger stress response. Now, other types, and so that's kind of one type that I'll put out there. And it's not necessarily that they're clean types and it's one thing or the other. That's just kind of one form that seems to show up. But I want to talk about a different form that ties in better with the schemas. Other people that present with depression and anxiety, if you put them in a magnetic resonance imaging machine, and you look at where blood flow is occurring, and you can give them stimulus or you can ask them questions or whatever. And if you look at how the blood flow is changing, we can get what's called a functional MRI. I don't do this work, but I think it's important to sort of discuss this, and then we can talk about it in animal models. And what you oftentimes see is that there's a brain region called the anterior cingulate cortex that is sort of on the midline. So it's sort of medial in the prefrontal cortex. It becomes hyperactive. And this correlates very strongly with anxiety, and especially what's called negative rumination. And so what this is unwanted compulsive thoughts about something bad that either did happen or could happen. So bereavement is a good one, like you just can't get over a loved one dying. Or on the other hand, it could be I'm afraid of flying because might get hijacked, or something that's very low probability, has never happened to you, that really shouldn't have cause for worrying about it, but you do, and you just can't help it.
Mm-hmm.
So when those things are happening, it looks like the anterior cingulate is involved in that. And so this is one brain region that I've been studying in animals. And it's a little bit special for a few reasons, one of which is that it's one of these parts of the neocortex that's phylogenetically conserved. So whereas, a rat doesn't have this lateral prefrontal cortex, that's unique to the the great apes, and other monkeys as well. The medial parts are conserved, so you can find a homologue of that in rats, mice. Actually, I don't know about alligators. I don't know too much about the other animals. Anyway, so the anterior cingulate though has sort of special connectivity with the hippocampus. So going back to what you were mentioning before about how these schemas sort of, there's some product of your experience, either direct experience or things you've read on the internet or have heard from your friends or all of these different things, right? They get sort of processed in your memory systems and then exported in some way to your neocortex. And it looks like the anterior cingulate has a very strong connectivity with the hippocampus. So it somehow is very strongly linked with the memory systems, or one of the key components of a memory system. But this anterior cingulate is also well connected with these sort of brainstem structures that trigger anxious-like behaviors. So freezing. It's also connected with neurons in what's called the lateral hypothalamus that release CRH, the corticotropin releasing hormone, which gives you the adrenaline response. So it's hooked up to other cells that control heart rate and breathing and all this other physiological stuff that you feel with stress. So what it looks like is that this area is somehow, at this nexus of, learning systems, but it's more than just learning. It's the knowledge that has been acquired, and it's sort of these mental models or schemas. And so this anterior cingulate cortex seems to be important for schemas. And, again, it's connected with sort of the stress effectors, so the things that actually produce the physiological symptoms of stress. And what's, the sort of state of the art, what we know is that antidepressants, for instance, reduce activity there. For people with major depression who do not respond to drug treatments, the last line of defense is actually to go in and make lesions of this anterior cingulate. So you go in with an electrode, a surgeon goes in with an electrode, actually applies electrical current to essentially ablate that material. And the success rate is like more than 2/3. So these are people who, could barely get out of bed, we're not responsive to several different kinds of drugs, to talk therapy, to anything. You go in and zap it, and they're like, hey, all right, things aren't so bad. Which, I think is why, myself and other people are quite interested in what that brain region is doing. One thing I'll add to this is that, even though it seems to be a key player in anxiety and depression, to really understand what's going on, we have to know what it's doing sort of in other contexts as well. Like, what's its main job? And then we have to know that in order to know how does it go wrong.
I see. Yeah, it kind of comes back to the notion you touched on earlier of thinking in neuroethological terms. Like,
right.
what is actually the circuit or this area doing? Why did it evolve? What is it doing for the animal in its natural state? And that can perhaps help you guys make sense of what it's doing when it goes awry.
Yes, exactly. And if I can, well, a bit of this is speculation, but one of the kind of neat things that has come to my attention. So, one of the things, but one unfortunate thing about sciences is that we end up getting what's called siloed, meaning that I might study this anterior cingulate cortex, somebody else is studying olfaction or something, something else. And that those communities don't necessarily talk a whole lot, partly because, there's now hundreds of thousands of research articles in each one of these disciplines. And it's become, there's just too much information for any one person to to synthesize. And so we're kind of forced in that way. But what's interesting about coming back to the anterior cingulate cortex, what's interesting about that is that in one of these other silos, people have been looking at what's called observational learning. And so if you put, again, someone in a functional magnetic resonance imaging system, and so first of all, if you give them pain, so if you poke them on the finger a little bit or whatever, you'll see part of this, the cingulate cortex light up. It's actually a little bit more posterior, so it's not exactly the same anterior cingulate, but it's a continuum, just to be clear about this. So if you poke them, you'll see that parts seem to respond to pain. They also respond to videos of people in pain. It also is for people that are in precarious situations. So, if you've ever seen an image of, again, for me, like in mountain biking, if you see someone, biking on the skinny little trail that's right on a cliff, right? It makes me sweat, it makes me quite uncomfortable. Again, even though I haven't done that, I've not gotten hurt doing that. But, what I know about the world is that there's gravity and that, trails have gravel on them, and I know they're slippery. So it's quite conceivable, I might be about to see some dude, fall off the cliff. And, coming back to why do people do that? Again, it's this idea that there's a social component to it. And so, particularly, what we know about primate behavior is that there are dominant, there's sort of this, social dominance hierarchies, and there's the alpha male, and, people will challenge the alpha male. So if I'm a upcoming teenager monkey, and I see my buddy go over and challenge the alpha and get his butt completely kicked, it's like, well, maybe I shouldn't do that, right? Because if I do it, A, I might get hurt, and B, by doing that, that's going to lower my social standing. And so, the other animals in my troop might not share as much food, or, I might not get as much benefit. So I think that's where this comes from, that what our brain does is it's now so attuned to taking in information so that we don't necessarily have to make the mistakes. So we can learn from the mistakes of others so that we ourselves don't mediate them. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, this is a speculation. And the reason I think that we get this physiological responses is that it's important for the learning process. So we talked about reinforcement learning before, that you actually, you need to feel like if it tastes good, the value goes up. If it tastes bad or it hurts, right, the value goes down. And so by watching these videos, by actually embodying a negative affective state of fear, worry, whatever, we're actually learning from that. And mm-hmm. that's a useful component of learning.
Yeah.
By watching and then actually, feeling the pain that, if my, teenage monkey buddy's getting his butt kicked, I'm actually feeling, empathy for him. But that's actually helping me learn. It's driving my learning systems without having to actually suffer the consequences directly.
Yeah, it makes sense. You might think, I'm someone who's like really sensitive to, if I'm watching a movie or something and I see someone get a paper cut, like I almost can't stand it. Now it doesn't obviously literally hurt like me getting a paper cut does, but there is this sort mm-hmm. of real physiological response, even if it's not fully what I would get if I was in that situation. And, naively, one might think, well, why does that type of response in me need to be baked in at all? But if what you're saying is true, it almost sounds like the physiological side of it, the actual feeling of the simulated thing that I have in mind or that I'm viewing, is somehow necessary for a learning component of this that needs to be there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think, and again, it's speculation, but I would put a good wager that this is true. But that, the systems can have exaggerated responses. So, a paper cut is sort of, is a great example. It's something, you don't want to have happen, but it's not life-threatening either. It's not the same as, watching people do insane stunts and feeling that. And if we can actually cycle back, I think this actually makes a good segue. So back to depression. Mm-hmm. So, so what does that mean? Well, in depression, linking this back to the schemas, is that depression and anxiety are oftentimes associated with what are called negative schemas. So these are schemas in which you expect bad things to happen, even though the evidence you've had shouldn't really necessarily suspect that. One example of this is that, if I'm sitting in a room full of people and I'm kind of glancing around and I see someone who's kind of looking in my direction with a scowl, if you have, a positive schema, you might think, oh, that, what happened to that guy? Maybe he just got dumped, or, he lost some money in the stock market. We don't know, who knows? But if you have a negative schema, you might think, oh, gee, that guy, he doesn't like me.
Mm-hmm.
Or, it's something sort of internalized, that there's some negative thing about you that's causing this to happen. So, that would be an example of a negative schema. I mean, also the example I gave before about flying and having, flying, your chances of dying in flight are much less than other modes of transportation, particularly driving. But, the sort of the fear states and the negative schemas aren't necessarily driven by facts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a testament to this overlap between, or intersection between, learning and memory systems and emotion systems.
So two people could have the exact same schema, the exact same mental model of something they're looking at or something that they're imagining, but one person might just be biased towards, pulling that in a negative direction and framing it in terms of fear, or, just thinking about something negatively. Everything else is the same. We might both be thinking about the same airplane and the same vacation, but you're thinking about the positive side of where you're going when you get on the plane, and I'm simply thinking about the negative side of how much I hate flying.
Yeah, so I would actually phrase that a little bit differently, and I would say that you and I might have the same data. So pretend that we have the same data, but that your schema is a little bit negative than mine because of other experiences you had that weren't related to that data, right? So by data, I mean, here's a little dossier on everything we know about flying. So pretend you and I didn't know anything about airplanes. We got this pamphlet on, here's how it works. Here's, the safety records and all that stuff. The, sort of the schemas that we develop, or the internal models we develop, are going to be colored by all sorts of other things, other life experiences, also by genetics and other things that aren't even in our control. And that then having that, having constructed that model, and then we ask, someone asks you, and then I, how do you feel about this? And I'm like, instead of taking, a boat across the Atlantic for a week to get to London, you can now do it in 6 hours. It's amazing. I'm going to see Big Ben. Versus, oh, that's up in the air. This is a new technology. If that thing falls, I'm dead. And so I think that's how I would think about it. And again, it starts to get more into the psychology literature, or the psychology end that I'm not nearly as well versed in. But you could very much imagine that these aren't fixed things. Mm-hmm. And so they can wax and wane with, the variety of neurotransmitters and hormones that you've got. So, you might kind of feel one way about something one day, and then you sleep poorly, and then the next day, we know that sleep disruption affects all sorts of hormones and neurotransmitter concentrations. And so you might think differently about it the next day. So these aren't necessarily sort of fixed entities.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I wanted to get your perspective on is how, different drugs affect these kinds of things, how drugs can sort of tip the scales one way or the other in terms of how we make decisions, what decisions we're predisposed to making, and things like, schemas and how we're modeling the world. There's a variety of directions we could take on this. I know that one drug class that you've looked at somewhat are stimulants, amphetamines. And I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about how that class of drugs affects things like decision-making and attention. I think something like Adderall, for example, would be something that a lot of people have heard about, but I know that there's some interesting effects of these things that differ in terms of, the dose you take or whether or not you're taking them acutely or chronically.
Absolutely. And so, it gets very complicated because the direct action of the drug can be different than so first of all, it often depends on dose. So one thing that shows up all the time in pharmacology is that a little bit of something can have a different effect than a lot of something. And so, a good example of that would be caffeine or alcohol. So a little bit of caffeine, a little bit of alcohol can actually increase attention, increase, perceived energy. But if you then go and have 20 espressos on a dare or something, your attention actually falls off. So same thing happens with amphetamine. So low levels of amphetamine increase attention, vigilance, which again, these are psychological terms that I think we're coming close to understanding more in terms of what does that mean in terms of neural function. And it can affect how people value things. And as you increase the dose, those effects kind of revert. So at low dose, oftentimes it has a very facilitating effect on attention, memory retention, all those sorts of things. But at a higher dose, it has a deleterious effect. One really interesting thing, and this goes to how memory occurs, is that, so let's talk about learning for a minute. So if you teach, so you're going to teach a rat to do something, say when the light comes on, he presses a lever, he gets some reward. If you give him a little bit of amphetamine, he can oftentimes learn that more quickly. And so we can measure that in two ways, like how many trials does it take to get to the criteria, or you give them a certain number of trials. So let's say we do it 20 times on day one, and then we come back on day two and just ask how quickly can they do it, or how well did they do it. If you give them amphetamine at low dose and do the same number of trials and then ask the next day, it looks like they've had more training, right? So they actually look better at it. What's really interesting though, is you can train them without amphetamine, give them the 20 trials, wait a half an hour, then give them amphetamine, bring them back the next day, and you also see this facilitating effect. And the most likely explanation for that is that a lot of learning occurs in your downtime. Mm-hmm. So when you're sleeping, but even quiet sort of restfulness, what appears to happen is that, at least in some cases, the brain tends to recapitulate the activity that was going on when you were doing the task. And so it looks like amphetamine can affect not only the direct experience, but also sort of the brain's recreation of that afterwards. And so, this is one reason that, good sleep is important, and probably just having downtime, hanging out in a hammock or whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. The brain is recapitulating what happened to it in the moment, and how it does that, and whether or not there's a drug in the system can impact how that's happening, and whether or not the memory is consolidated as much or gets weakened, for example.
Exactly. Yeah.
I know this isn't your direct area, but that actually, so that reminds me of this other topic that I've discussed many times on the podcast, stuff that's getting a lot of attention in the popular media as well, with some of the concepts you were telling us about earlier, and that's what psychedelics have been doing in various clinical trials. The thing that I wanted your take on here is the following. What strikes me as is that you've seen these very striking clinical trial results so far for things like depression, for things like addiction, that are very complex disorders that we really don't understand, and they're very personal, right? The way that one person's depression or addiction is going to manifest is not going to be identical to someone else's. And you've seen some of these drugs in the context of psychotherapy have very, very strong effects at alleviating, say, a severe addiction or severe depression. And you've seen comparable, at least directionally similar effects with different drugs. So for example, addiction effects for something like ibogaine and psilocybin. They're both strongly psychoactive, but they're operating through different mechanisms. They're different drugs. Something like MDMA and psilocybin for things like, depression or PTSD. And so directionally, you're seeing these similar effects. They're alleviating these very negative, very complex neuropsychiatric disorders. We don't know exactly how all these things are working at a mechanistic level, but it sort of reminds me of the things you were talking about earlier around schemas and our ability to modulate, sort of the positive or the negative valence on the schema. And I'm wondering if you've thought at all about, how or why drugs like this might be having this type of effect on something like severe depression.
That is the $1 trillion question.
Yeah.
I mean, that really, if we could answer that question, we would know so much about the brain, and it'd be marvelous. I think it's unpacking what you've just asked touches on a lot of very important, very fundamental things. So let me preface this by saying that what a lot of the deleterious things on schemas, so the things that tend to push towards depression, towards anxiety, towards the negative schemas, things like stress, things like psychostimulant abuse, things like inflammation, which turns out to be a big one. One of the things all these do is they reduce spine density in a few areas, including this anterior cingulate cortex and in the hippocampus. They do a lot of other stuff too. So
they reduce the number of connections in certain parts of the brain.
Yes. And what may be happening, and again, there's some evidence for this, but again, everything in neuroscience, it's, it takes a lot of evidence to say anything with a lot of confidence. But I'll give you my take. And again, this is partly speculative. Mm-hmm. What we do know is that the spines are lost. What I believe is happening is that the spines that remain essentially become dominant. And they could become dominant in such a way that now it's hard to change that schema. So as I was mentioning before, these schemas, they can be updated. They, from day to day, even they can kind of modulate a little bit, right? They shouldn't really be fixed. Like as new information comes in, you should update that. But if you start to lose a lot of spines, and then the ones that are left over, what happens is that these schemas sort of crystallize into something. And if that something isn't good, or is associated with negative affective outcomes, what happens is that as the information comes in, it sort of runs through the schema. You can't really change the schema. So imagine something like the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex kind of filters that, and then it starts to activate these deep brain structures that trigger these sort of anxious, depressive sort of phenotypes, right? And so that would be one way to think about this. Well, how would you get over that? Well, if you could, for instance, make it more likely that you could then update these schemas, that would be one thing to do. One thing that all the psychedelics do is that they regrow spines in the neocortex like crazy.
Yeah, the last guest I had on was Alex Kwan, and he actually showed us some of that data where you give the mouse psilocybin in this case, and new spines start forming. There's a net gain in number of spines forming in certain parts of the neocortex. But what was especially interesting to me was this continues to happen after the drug is gone.
Yeah. And so we don't understand the molecular mechanisms. So there are a number of molecules that are floating around that serve as growth factors. Essentially, they serve as molecular signals to essentially polymerize the cytoskeleton inside the neuron, which then forms the synapse, and then a number of other things have to happen to make that functional. But it turns out that there was a phenomenal paper a few years ago that showed that many different psychedelics do this. So psilocybin, LSD, a very short-acting one called DOI, and a few others. It turns out that ketamine does this as well, even though its site of action. So the psychedelics, the main psychedelic action happens because of agonism of the what's called the 5-HT2A receptor. So that's one of the serotonin receptors. So when you agonize that, you get the psychedelic effects. If you block that, even if you give a psychedelic, you don't get the psychedelic effects. Whereas ketamine blocks an NMDA receptor, which is quite different. But what's interesting is that the ketamine-induced spine growth depends on the 5-HT2A receptor. So even though its primary site of action is a different receptor type, it somehow is also tickling that 5-HT2A. We also know that antidepressants also grow spines, but much, much slower.
I see.
So it's really tempting to speculate that that's why it takes antidepressants so long to work, whereas psychedelics, tend to go very quickly. Now, we have no idea why, and there can be. So I've been putting a lot of thought towards this recently, and there are several different explanations. So one of which is that you could turn down the effectors, meaning those, very deep brain centers that trigger avoidance and freezing and increased heart rate and, all those physiological symptoms. It might somehow turn down their excitability. Maybe they become hyperactive. Number two, it could somehow be affecting the memory / schemas. Like maybe it somehow, attenuates those. A third possibility is that what they might be able to do is help competing memories or brain systems become more competitive against the negative schemas. So what I mean by that is that you're not, what the general consensus is that, if you're going to play chess, you have like a chess schema that you're using, right? But if you're going to go and do something else, that, you can somehow swap these mental models in and out as you need to. And what we also know is that when an animal or human has a bad experience and generates fear response, that fear response will attenuate over several days, like a week to 2 weeks. So if you shock a rat or a mouse in a chamber and then you put them back in there the next day, they freeze. You keep putting them in there day after day. What you see is that the freezing is less and less and less. That's not because they're forgetting, because if you give them a reminder, even a very brief reminder, that memory comes back lickety split. What seems to happen in the interim time is that some competing safe memory comes on that sort of suppresses all that, the fear response. So again, it could also be that what psychedelics are doing is they're potentiating other ways of, for a better way to describe this, that they're potentiating some other way to look at the problem so that you're not predominated by the sort of negative way of looking at it. And when you do that, then you're not sort of triggering the activation of those stress effectors. Right now, it's all speculative. Like it might be one or more of those things or something I didn't even mention. It's sort of the wild, wild west for psychedelic research right now.
Yeah, but the common thread is whenever it's been looked for, it sounds like there is this increase or at least change in the amount of structural plasticity that's happening in response to these drugs. And that's probably what you would expect if they were to have this kind of effect, right? Because at some level, it must be true that if you're going to get over something like depression or addiction, right, circuits need to change. They need to be sort of hooked up differently, however that manifests. So if there is increased plasticity, that's at least making it possible for such a change to occur. Yeah.
I agree. But how it happens, hopefully we'll know, within years, but it's hard to forecast in neuroscience. But it's sort of interesting because it also brings up, maybe of interest to your listeners is it brings up an ethical question as well. Certainly someone who has severe trauma in their past and, here's a way to help them, right? I don't think anybody would really argue that that's sort of an ethical use. But you sort of get into the slippery slope when you can start to modify memories or responses to memories. And this is where pop culture and other people may be a little ahead of the game. So one of my favorite movies is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which I forget how many years ago that was, but at that time it was completely, fantasy land. But who knows with current technology, how things are going, is it okay to just go in and modify people's memory?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I don't think we're too far from that capability.
I don't think so. Well, because imagine if you knew, hey, I could make a lot of money, but it's going to cause suffering of a bunch of people. But afterwards, I could just have that erased from my mind.
There's people who would do that.
Right? So, there's this link of, I don't know how strong the evidence is, but it's certainly, in pop culture, the idea that, CEOs sort of lack empathy and they kind of have to, because they have to make decisions that are, often going to have negative consequences for employees or other people.
Hmm. Yeah, almost a more utilitarian mindset. Might be negative in the short term, even if it's beneficial in the longer term or whatever. But one of the things I did want to ask you about, and again, we're going to step away from the actual science and your research a little bit, but I think that's okay if you're okay with it. I wanted to ask you, someone like you, what your general take is on the impact of mobile technology and social media on cognition. And I think everyone probably has an opinion about this that's directionally similar, but I thought you might have an interesting perspective. I would speculate that many people listening probably have had a similar experience to me, which is that over time, as our cell phones got more and more intriguing and powerful, and as we spend more time online and engaging with social media, speaking for myself, my ability to sustain attention on one thing deeply for a long time has degraded somewhat over time. And, when I start to think about people, basically anyone younger than me, I'm sort of about, I think, as young as you can be, where most of my childhood was spent in the absence of these technologies. When I start to think about people who've grown up with, that cell phone in their pocket the whole time, what is that doing to their brain and their ability to have a cognition that's similar to mine? How much different could, the way that people that are just growing up now, how much different is their cognition going to be, their ability to sustain attention and to think about things in the way that I implicitly assume everyone else thinks about them? What's your take about on how social media in particular is affecting or degrading our ability to focus and attend and decide?
Sorry, what'd you say? No, just kidding. No, exactly. I mean, let me answer a related question first. So that kind of follows from what we've been discussing so far, which is that, social media in particular, I think tends to, or has enabled information filters or information bubbles, unlike what people have seen before. Mm-hmm. And I think we have no idea what the consequences are. And I think, I worry, again, this is hand-waving speculation. This is not me as a scientist. This is me sort of as a, general person and parent, sort of worried about the state of things that, what I was mentioning about schemas is that it's all a function of not only your direct experience, but what you're reading, what you're hearing from people. And so, how can you possibly, I don't know how you explain sort of the bifurcation that you see on a lot of topics, right? Masking versus anti-masking. Like, how can people be, again, if everybody had the same information, you wouldn't think it would be so polarized, right? You'd have some distribution where, most people think this, some are on one extreme end or the other, but it's really kind of a bimodal thing that, it's like you have to do it or you're Hitler, or, if you do it, then you hate freedom, mm-hmm. Right? It's really, right, the thinking around it is very almost diametrically opposed. And you can see that in a lot of places. I mean, I think in the political sphere, particularly. And so I think, again, I think social media is one of the enablers of that. I think it's one of the reasons that, what do I want to say? Manipulation of information on social media platforms is really a problem and really needs to be addressed. So, the things that were going on with certain platforms before the last two U.S. elections, it's really problematic where, you can pay to either bump up or bump down certain information, whether it's true or not. Probably has a big influence on the way people see the world and interpret things. And, that has huge influence on not only politics, but, it's the name of the game in terms of selling people things and, commercialism. So, at some point we really got to think about, what's it doing, what's the long-term consequences. Now, onto your other question, which was, was it due to attention spans? I have no idea. That's really outside of, what I know directly. Again, the sort of, what do I want to say? Sort of one of the popular interpretations is that, you get your phone out because you want to see, you're hoping to see a like on something, or you're hoping to see, an interesting story. And when that happens, that's something salient to you. You get this little dopamine hit, and that's reinforcing. Again, the idea that dopamine, it doesn't say whether it's good or bad, but that it's relevant to you. And so in that case, it doesn't really matter if someone's saying, this person who's politically juxtaposed to your positions, something bad happened to them, or they said something outrageous, right? It doesn't necessarily mean if it's good or bad, but it's just as relevant to you and your schemas and your, the group that you associate with. And so, how much does that interfere with getting, the business of what you need to do during the day done? For me personally, it certainly is alluring. Right? Mm-hmm. People really like information. And now that we essentially have this unlimited bandwidth of information of various quality coming at us all the time, it gets hard to concentrate on other things.
How intentional are you? So given your background and the nature of, your work, how intentional are you with, putting in guardrails to limit access to your phone and things like that? Or if you have kids, do you have any guardrails that you put up for them?
I do. And I know the whole argument of nature versus nurture is way outside of the scope of what we're talking about. So I don't know the reason, but I have a 14-year-old daughter, and, that's at the age now where she reports at school that many of the kids in class, when they have downtime, she said they're just on their phone. And so it's been hard for her to make friends. We relocated school districts recently. So I certainly see that, even though she herself doesn't have any aspirations to, but I absolutely, would put limits on stuff. So we have limits on screen time. I use the parental controls on all the devices to try to limit it. Me personally, my kids are more interested in things like Minecraft, which I think is not, I don't know, doesn't really have a lot of the problems of what we were talking about, but as long as it's within reason. But social media, I think, I hate to say it, I don't like to make this comparison, but it's almost like drugs where, I keep having to relay this to my kids too, that we now know that the prefrontal cortex in humans isn't fully matured until now mid-20s. Used to be thought it was like 18, and then it was 20, and it just keeps getting pushed back and back. Mm-hmm. And so, if you start to have things, drugs or experiences that start to influence that before it's fully developed, I think you get different outcomes. To me, it's kind of funny, right? So me growing up, I'm a product of the early 70s. So I didn't even have a computer till I went to college. I didn't have a cell phone until, I don't know, it's like 30. So to me, it occurred very late. Neighbors in my neighborhood are in their 70s. We were just having an internet issue recently. It was very intermittent. And I asked both of my neighbors, one is 65, the other one's, again, is in the 70s. I was like, oh, are you having problems with your internet? And each one of them said, I don't know, I haven't used it for a couple of days. And I was like, what? Could check anything? So, I think definitely we can see the progression.
Well,
I think it's important to limit it. I really do. I try to limit it on myself. I tend to creep back to spending too much time, mostly on news aggregators more so than other things, but even that's too much. So it takes an active battle.
I don't want to take too much more of your time, Aaron. You've been very generous. Any final thoughts you want to leave people with about any of the general topics we were talking about within the realm of cognitive neuroscience, or any resources, books, or places on the internet people might go to learn more about this stuff, generally speaking, if they don't have a hardcore neuroscience background?
That is a really good question. I guess one passing thought I would like to leave people with is one is a sort of tale of caution, which is, beware of what you read. Unfortunately, a lot of journalism I see on science is pretty off. And it's really hard to negotiate fact from fiction without having some expertise in it. So, definitely, when you read something, and especially if it's making bold claims, verify the source, try to look into it a little bit before you take it on its face, which is something I actually have an exercise that I have my undergraduates do. So they have to take something in the news and then kind of do a critical review of it. And I wish there was a really trustworthy source of information. I will say that the NIH, National Institute of Health, they're the chief sponsor of a lot of the biomedical research that goes on in the United States. They do a good job. So they're quite unbiased in information. So that's a good place to look for things. I also think the future is pretty bright in terms of fixing some of the problems that we've got, like depression and anxiety. I would again caution people. I think psychedelics are probably going to be very efficacious, but beware of too many bold claims, or I think there's going to be a gold rush in terms of people trying to profit off of it and kind of making bold claims and those sorts of things. So do your due diligence on that end.
All right, Professor Aaron Gruber, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. It was a pleasure talking with you today.